on the 11th of September 2012, and HGP formally began trading in October 2013, which is more than a year later. But this whole issue of juristic representation is something that I don't know if Mr. Matlwele can deal with it, but certainly Mr. Wheatley will be able to deal with it.
Can I ask you something first? So HFM had a license, and then HDP applied to be a juristic rep using the HFM license. Is that correct? Is that what I'm hearing?
Just perhaps so that there isn't any misstatement or any point that, let's say, I'm not 100% on this point, I will ask my compliance officer at Harith to write a statement as to what happened when, on which date, and how this relates. And I think it might perhaps be much more 100% on point than what I would try and maybe put together now here. And with all those dates, sometimes just being a difference of a month and what happened when. But in my understanding, we've always traded properly all the time with proper licenses. So that difference of a month, but can I ask my compliance officer to please prepare that statement on behalf of the Commission and then present and submit to Advocate Labour perhaps for submission to yourselves, Chair.
That's fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thanks for the offer.
I think that's very welcome, but just for clarification, if there was any period in which HFM stopped functioning, ceded the work to HGP, and then HGP traded with that license for any period of time, or without a license or without due process, whether it's for a week or whatever the period of time is, to see that actually when that authorization was given to HGP, if that can be included in the statement as to what licensing prevailed at what point in time.
That will be done, Chair.
I think, Mr. Matlwele, you were at paragraph 46 of your statement.
The second fund, PIDF2, in the amount of $435 million was raised by Harith General Partners with the following investors: the Government Employee Pension Fund, DTD, AFDB, DBSA, and BPOPF. PIDF was finally closed with no further funding contributions in June 2016, and the funds invested in similar projects as PIDF1. As at March 2018, the GEPF's initial investment commitment in the sum of $350 million of the overall investment value of the fund of $435 million had been drawn down only to an extent of some $87.5 million. The total value of that investment was independently valued at $102.6 million, equating to some 1.2 billion rands. Okay, at $102 million from the 87 million invested. Between March 2018 and February 2019, the further sum invested by the GEPF then increased to almost $182 million. There were some more investments made during the period of that year. The gross IRR earned to March 2018 was 44.4% in US dollar terms and 40% in ZAR terms, so it's 44% in US dollar terms on that investment.
Can I ask that when we're doing internal rates of return, we actually do net, not gross? You can do gross and net, but not just gross. And that would assume that this is 182 million drawn down of $350 million. Is that correct?
Yes, Chair.
Yeah.
Your
Sorry, forget myself. The same principles of scrutiny, accountability, and transparency as described for PIDF1 apply also in regard to PIDF2. Since the inception of the two funds, the position has remained the same and PIC has never been an investor in either of PIDF 1 or PIDF 2. The investment process can be described as follows. The Herith team sources projects, reviews them for presentation to the PIDF Investment Committee. The investment committee is made up of 10 representatives. In that investment committee, you have banks, and institutional investors form part of that investment committee. So all those investors that I mentioned, they have representatives on the investment committee. I think it's a very clear case of the capital owners looking after their money very closely. Herith proposes investments to the investment committee. The investment committee reviews those proposals. Those that pass the investment committee's review test are then recommended for approval to the Board of Trustees, which also has an investor representation.
That's the Board of Trustees of the PIDF.
Of PIDF. It is made in the main by the investors in the fund, the Board of Trustees, with only about 2 independents, and also myself, the CEO of Herith General Partners, as a trustee.
And among those trustees on the board are GEPF representatives?
Among those trustees, you have GEPF representatives. GEPF has 2 representatives.
And who chairs it?
The PIDF is chaired by Renosi Mokate at the moment. She's the current chair of the GEPF.
That's
So she
fine,
chairs the
yeah.
fund.
I just wanted to see that the GEPF is there and what their role is in that board of trustees.
Okay. They have actually 2 representatives on the Board of Trustees.
And there are other representatives?
The other representatives, APSA has 2 representatives, Old Mutual has a representative, African Development Bank. It's afternoon, man, it's going slower. Please bear with me.
Okay.
Okay, but then, as I said, it's got some of all these investors on it. In the main, all of them. That's why for us, the construct of this fund works very well in the sense that you have the investors very close to the money, impacting on how it's done and how it's managed, and being very close to its performance. The first trustees of the PIDF were appointed in accordance with the terms.
I think you left out 51.7, which is quite important.
The PIDF Board of Trustees has final approval regarding which of the recommended investments are to be made. The first trustees of the PIDF were appointed in accordance with the terms of the trust deed. The first trustees in turn appointed investor trustees in accordance with their participation ratio in terms of the trust deed of the fund. And below I set up the criteria for eligibility of each investor to appoint a trustee to the Board of Trustees. I don't know, Council, can I pass these?
I think you can jump over there.
Can I jump over that because it just says how each represents? Paragraph 53.
Yeah.
The PIDF Board of Trustees is a final decision-making body in all matters relating to the PIDF, including its investments. Both the PIDF Investment Committee and the Board of Trustees are controlled by its investors, the people who own the capital. With currently 7 investor participants, myself and the 2 independent trustees that I talked about. I must point out that Herith General Partners has co-invested with a number of financiers on large-scale projects, which is a norm to reduce risk exposure to financing parties. This is a norm in all major infrastructure projects that you find a multitude of investors. In Lake Turkana, as I mentioned, there's over like 12 investors in that one project from all over the world. The PIDF has co-invested with a number of institutions and investors such as the Africa Finance Corporation of Nigeria, the African Development Bank, the European Bank, the European Investment Bank, Standard Chartered Bank, FinFund, which is like the Finnish government's development fund, Rand Merchant Bank, Investec, Remgro, BMC Bank International, Sky Bank, First City Monument Bank, First Bank of Nigeria, MIGA, which is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency of the World Bank, and which like also provides most of some of our, insurance cover on some of the projects across the continent. The IFC, which is the World Bank investment arm, it's also a partner in the airports in Tunisia. FMO, which is the Dutch government's development finance investment arm, and KfW, which is the German government's development fund. All these developed DFIs by these European entities and American entities are very active in the infrastructure space across the continent. The PIDF and the PIC have also co-invested in 2 projects in South Africa, which is Lanseria International Airport and Kelvin Power Station. These projects, and in those projects, PIC invested for its own purposes, they didn't fund us, and then the PIDF invested for its own account. The same in Kelvin and Lanseria. I'm pleased to note that the investments of PIDF has made were mostly greenfield projects. These have a much more developmental impact on the continent, including the creation of employment, stimulating economic activity, and skills development. A table of investments in respect of PIDF 1 and PIDF 2 can be found on pages 3 and 4, which we have dealt with earlier. Many of these investments and projects have received awards. See page 5 and 6, which is in my exhibit 3, listing of all these awards. We are very proud in terms of the impact in terms of some of these have done, and even PIDF 1 and PIDF 2, even as funds in themselves by the developmental impact that they've had, they've also won funds in their own right over the years. The cavalier allegation by Mr. Olomisa that these projects are underperforming lacks any factual basis. On the contrary, these projects have created a demonstrable developmental impact on the continent, and the funds are on course to deliver very favorable returns to investors in this regard. Harith has invested in over 14 signature infrastructure projects over the 2 funds that it currently manages. If I might say, and perhaps just allow me one line to sort of brag about a project like Lake Turkana in Kenya, which is one of the largest renewable projects, and it's a wind power project in Kenya, 310 megawatts in that environment. I think it's a very it's something to be proud of. Something like Henry Konan Bridge, if you can see, and if you go to Abidjan and you see what that one bridge has done for the city, it's very impressive. So these are the type of things that sort of we do across the continent. Out of the $660 million of equity invested in these projects that we have put together in these funds, I should highlight that an additional $4.9 billion of financing has been unlocked for the continent. This is in the form of some of the debt and some of the mesh structures and some of the insurance which cover some of these projects. So that equity which has been done out of this fund has really unlocked a lot. If I make an example of what the continent looked like in 2006, what we invested then and what it is today, we believe and will continue to invest even PIDF 2 on the basis that the next 5 years will be better than the last 5 that we come from. This figure excludes the joint ventures which we have with AFC, which is like the power IPP that I talked about, where 2 other projects, which is Sen Power, a 400 megawatt gas-fired power plant, supplying power to the Ghanaian grid, has a total project cost of some $600 million, and Kabeliolika, which is a 26 megawatt wind farm operating the majority of the power on the island of Cape Verde.
Just a question here on 6.2. Do you take preference shares and MES on your own, or you guys you just write the equity checks only?
Sometimes, Chair, with even structure, even some of our equity, perhaps as even a shareholder loan, so that perhaps we can then maybe start generating some form of drawing on some of the cash which comes out of the project, or so that there's it's not necessarily a smaller component of equity, but it's just a structured as debt sometimes becomes a bit perhaps more tax effective from a return point of view. and that's what we do. But we are in pure equity, we are in some of like the MES instruments you'd look at. We also like would do things which look like a shareholder loan, but in the main being an equity instrument. Both our funds are equity funds. So therefore, that's the main focus, and that's why it's been able to unlock all of these other projects. And this is the biggest problem why these two funds were created. Africa lacks equity capital to support her long-term developmental needs in the form of infrastructure. And much more of this capital is still needed to make sure that infrastructure can be built. And we need people to take a bet on that. That's where the biggest thing is, and that's why even in the beginning, the PIDF, went beyond other funds and was structured as a 15-year fund. These projects have created over 6,000 direct jobs and thousands of indirect jobs. If I talk about something like Main One in Nigeria, this has done a lot of indirect jobs by all the other ISPs which have been created. We've contributed to economic growth and enormous tax to governments. We have attracted leading pension funds, including the Social Security National Insurance Trust of Ghana. We have the Botswana Public Officers Pension Fund of Botswana as an investor, and the Government Institutions Pension Fund of Namibia, with the fund created in Namibia. And on the back of that, developed two regional funds, one in Namibia and one in Nigeria, with local asset managers there. These are world-class infrastructure projects developed in partnership with international and reputable project developers, as well as respected development finance institutions and banks.
Can I just take you back a second to 655.3? Did SSNIT of Ghana actually invest?
SNIT of Ghana, Chair? Yes, they have invested in PIDF 1. And actually, even when PIDF was launched initially, it was actually launched in Ghana, in Accra, in 2007. Yeah.
Chair, can I just say that Mr. Mahlwele has got now to paragraph 61 of his statement, which is where he deals with an overview of Lavash. This is a high-level discussion of what Mr. Wheatley is going to deal with in quite some detail. So I'm not sure to what extent the Commission would like Mr. Mahlwele to deal with this now, just to get an overview of what happened, but remembering that Mr. Wheatley is still going to be covering very much of the same ground. I know. Perhaps Mr. Mahlwele can just highlight his particular role in Lavash.
Yes, I think let's take that route.
And perhaps you can start just with the Coral Lagoon, just the history a bit there, because I know this has been a long story of PE transactions around there. Yeah.
So you can start at 61. Your microphone.
And I deal with my focus to Lavash Investment Group and how I became involved in that. Lavash is a private company, and its genesis has nothing to do with the PIC, although, as will be seen, it later contracted at arm's length with the PIC in various respects, which benefited both parties greatly. I'm a beneficial shareholder in Lavash to an extent of 27% of its issued share capital. I became a beneficial shareholder in an investment company called Coral Lagoon, my stake amounting to some 7%. If I can just perhaps I think for the benefit of the Commission, there was a consortium, like most BE consortiums, created in 2007, which was Coral Lagoon, and I was a part of that consortium to the extent of 7% to my beneficial shareholding. Coral Lagoon's sole business was its investment in Capitec Bank, of which it was a shareholder to the extent of the 10 million shares. By virtue of its shareholding in Capitec, Coral Lagoon was entitled to nominate a director to the Capitec board. I was so nominated and served as a non-executive director of Capitec from April 2007 to January 2011, when another director was appointed in my place. During 2012, Coral Lagoon approached the PIC with an offer that the PIC purchase some of its Capitec shares. In February 2012, the PIC purchased almost 5.3 million of those Capitec shares from Coral Lagoon for 156 rands per share. This sale was disclosed to the public through the Johannesburg Stock Exchange and published widely in the media on 29 February 2012. These announcements on are still available on the Capitec and JSE websites, as well as through a basic internet search. 3 years later, in 2015, Lavash was established, initially under the name of PetroTouch. PetroTouch Lavash presented a fully funded proposal for Lavash to purchase 5.3 million Capitec shares. By that stage, the Capitec share had risen in value to 325 rands per share. I think that was around March 2015, if I'm not wrong, but Mr. Whitley will allude to the finer details of this. The PIC was prepared to accept Lavash's offer to purchase the 5.3 million shares it had originally acquired from Coral Lagoon at 325 rands per share. But the deal was still subject to various conditions precedent. By the time those conditions were met, the share price had risen to 461 rands per share. This happened over a period of about 2-3 months, which nobody would have foreseen at that stage. The PIC insisted that the consideration payable under the agreement should be increased to 461 rands per share after agreement had been concluded at 325. Lavash was unhappy with the increased price because it had already secured funding for the entire transaction at 325 rand per share from Investec Bank. The increased price was a consequence of the delay caused by the PIC in satisfying some of the conditions precedent. It was eventually agreed that the PIC would lend the difference in the purchase price to Lavash to enable it to buy the shares. The amount of the loan of the difference which resulted as a result of the share price movement was 720 million rands. In summary, the PIC had purchased the shares from Coral Lagoon in February 2012 at 156. The PIC sold the shares in May 2015 at 461 to Lavash. The profit made by the PIC from this transaction was therefore 360 rands per share, which equated to some 1.7 billion rands. This sale was disclosed again in the public through a SENS announcement and published widely in media on 12 May 2015. These announcements are still available today on the Capitec and JSE websites, as well as through a basic internet search. The total cost of the shares amounted to approximately 2.4 billion rands. It was funded by Investec Corporate Bank to the extent of 1.7 billion, and in that shortfall, which happened as a result of the share price movement between March and May, to the tune of 720 million, was then plugged by PIC to the tune of 720 million.
Sorry, what interest rate was charged for the 720 million?
I might be wrong, Chair, but I think it was about 13%, if I'm not wrong.
Of course not.
Yeah, but I think, it was exorbitant. The loan received by Lavash from the PIC was disclosed in the PIC's widely publicized Isibaya investment schedule, which identified all the PIC's investments as at 31 March 2016. It was essentially a back-to-back mechanism whereby part of the purchase consideration due by Lavash to the PIC was deferred and spread out over a period of time. And I think we requested a period of 3 years to try and cover that. About 2 years later, we became interested in purchasing the remaining other 4.7 million shares which were in Coral Lagoon. As Lavash, we went to Coral Lagoon and said, can we buy some of their shares? Our intention always being that, from a Lavash point of view, to build a balance sheet. And perhaps that's where the name stems from. whereby we changed it from Petra Trust to Lavash, LE standing for Legacy, BA Balance, SHE sheet. Our aspiration is to build up a legacy balance sheet to that extent. Lavash approached the PIC, it says here the GEPF through a piece, but it just said, when agreements are done and loan agreements are done by the PIC, it says like done on behalf of the GEPF because the GEPF's funds.
That's quite an important question because given the issues earlier about what was a GEPF direct investment and the PIC, the PIC clearly acts in terms of its memorandum of understanding and delegations and agreements as the agent of the GEPF. So in terms of 7.4, when you're saying GEPF, are you talking about your interaction with the PIC or directly with the GEPF?
I'm talking about our interaction with the PIC.
Can we
On
then,
this transaction, Chair, there was no interaction. We didn't interact with the GEPF. It was an interaction with the PIC.
then can we amend 7.4 accordingly because otherwise it creates confusion as to who you are dealing with?
Yes, it's
Totally
it's
agree,
our
Chair.
fault.
Yes.
It's actually paragraph 74.
Yes.
Yes, and so the words, the GEPF through, those three words should be
Yeah.
deleted.
It's just Lavash approached the PIC. That's the right.
Yes.
You are right in that regard, Chair. This transaction, we were funded by the PIC, Peregrine Securities, and Sanlam. The funding which we secured was in the region of 1.4 billion rands, with 1.2 billion of that coming from the PIC. I think that should also be changed, Council, to PIC as opposed to GEPF.
So
Lavash's repayments of the GEPF loan are fully up to date, and the smaller loan has been repaid. The loan, which was like take to bridge us at the period when the share price moved between March and May of 2015, was fully repaid by, I think, the 7th or 14th of April 2018, wherein the whole 720 million was repaid with interest in excess of about 200 million rands.
Mr. Mahlwele, can I just pause there because there are some corrections that you've spoken about, but just to put them clearly on record. So the words, the GEPF through, in line 3 must be deleted, and
Yes,
then,
it must be Lavash approached the
And-
PIC for funding.
correct, and then when it says, after that,
Labashe's-
the funding was secured with the GEPF loaning Lavash, that should be the PIC loaning Lavash.
Yes, yes,
And then
Council.
again, in the third last line, Labashe's repayments of the GEPF loan should be of the PIC loan.
Yes, Council. This sale was disclosed to the public through a SENS announcement and published in the media on 7 July 2017. These announcements are still available on the Capitec and JC websites, as well as through a basic internet search. And I also dare say that
Continue.
even on the website of Lavash, the details of its transactions is also listed.
A question. When you kind of repay the PIC, do you sell shares or you get funding from somewhere to repay the PIC? Broadly?
Sorry, your microphone.
We were given a very strenuous short-term bridging thing for that balance of about 720 million, and we had to find a way to repay that within that 3-year period, the 700 million. Chair, we went to financial institutions, which helped us with raising that money. One of the big five supported us with that funding to enable us to pay that back.
Okay, great stuff. And then the 1.2 billion, how are you repaying it, the PIC amount? Are you paying through dividends or how is it being repaid?
We pay that twice a year through the dividends that we receive. And then with regard, if I may say, we want to believe, and there's ample security of that if you look at the amount of the shares that it is. And the other thing to note, Chair, is that these are restricted shares, Evergreen BE shares, so thereby meaning that they trade at a very steep discount to the intrinsic value. However, as a platform, we first of all can't find a way whereby we use this balance sheet to enable us to do other things and grow the company in terms of like other sectors. But then the other support in terms of funding, we've been able to source from the other banks and asset managers. The loan that Lavash received from PIC was also disclosed in its widely publicized Isibaya investment schedule, which identified all the PIC's investments as at 31 March 2018. In the first quarter of 2018, Lavash repaid in full the first loan, which I've already talked about.
Mr. Mahlele, sorry, I need to just interrupt you.
Okay.
For accuracy, paragraph 76, that schedule is dated 31 March 2017.
Okay.
It's Exhibit 5.
Okay. I'll accept-
Sorry, please
Okay.
continue.
Thank you. In the first quarter of 2018, Lavash repaid in full the first loan that it received from the PIC of 720 million in 2015 in respect of the first tranche of the Capitec shares, which we talked about earlier on. Lavash also paid the PIC all its accrued interest. The PIC therefore earned interest on this loan of 700 million in excess of 200 million over a period of 2.5 years. All of these transactions were above board, transparent, and at arm's length. The PIC profited and will continue to profit handsomely on these transactions. It has already received in excess of 1.7 billion rand in capital profits and in excess of 200 million in accrued interest.
A question? Yeah, question. Before you go to paragraph 79, just a broad question, and please, if you can, answer that if you can, I'm just asking. Lavash owns about 7.3% of Capitec, is that correct?
That's correct, Chair.
And the market cap of Capitec is around 160 billion rand, is that correct?
As at
Somewhere.
which price on which date, Chair? Because I think between now and like the last 3 months, the share price has been doing funny things. Not funny things, good
Yeah,
things.
yeah.
But then it has risen, I think, between, let's say, like the beginning of the year from about, let's say, like perhaps less than 1,000 rands to like maybe currently today about 1,300 rands. And then, last year, like with the, what was that, Viceroy sort of like debacle.
Then it went down.
Went down to about $700.
Yeah.
So that's been what we've been living
Oh,
for.
the
So it
average,
depends at which point in time you talk about. Chair.
Yesterday, let's just take.
I didn't
yesterday.
watch that one, I was here.
Okay,
so you can
see,
tell me better.
The share price is 1,670 somewhere there.
Serious?
1,300, yeah. Let's just say.
I think it's about 1,000. I don't know, you say,
1,300.
I haven't checked, yes.
Yeah, but just suffice to say, so your 7% is worth something like 11 billion rand. Is that correct?
Chair, yes, in the open market.
Say 10, 11 billion rand.
Without debt.
Yeah.
We have debt on our balance sheet.
I'm coming there.
Okay,
yeah.
yes,
And
Chair.
then
Yes, it's worth about.
Yeah, and then you
Debt.
took debt of 2.4 at the beginning, and then 1.2. I've just done the numbers here. 2.4 and 1.4, that is 3.8, but you sort of repaid that 720.
Yes, Chair.
So in total, you took debt of odd 3 billion rands, roughly, because 3.8 minus around 700 million, rough numbers.
No. You mean from the PIC, Chair?
From broadly, no, from all.
Oh, from broadly?
All the debt, yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes, Chair.
Yeah, so it's about 3 billion rand of debt. So
I think we have slightly more than that of
Okay,
debt, Chair.
all right.
Yes. So therefore, our net value
What
is not
is
the
the net-
number that you're thinking about, but we do have we have more debt than debt.
Okay. Yeah, okay.
As you can imagine,
Yeah.
why our debt would be a bit higher than that is that I'm not dealing here with a completely 100% marketable share. It's one which has restrictions, which therefore then would attract a lower than market price of what it is. Therefore, our ability to gear that up to the hilt you know, is not, is not possible, because then it's not a, it's shares which we can only trade amongst black participants, so therefore that's what happens to that value. So it just
The
does
NAV,
get a bit hampered.
Yeah.
We,
NAV,
yeah,
the
I'm
NAV
taking we're taking a long-term view on that stock, Chair. Yes, and as is clear, let me just leave it at that.
Chair, I can say that Mr. Wheatley will deal with this
We'll
aspect.
deal with that. Okay.
But that there's no doubt that Lavash's assets exceeds its liabilities.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That's fine. You can leave it.
Yeah, in that regard, in terms of like our currently 1.45 billion or debt due like to the PIC with interest, you know, they are fairly covered in terms of like the risk, and there are some other, you know, plans we have in future as to like know how to further even improve this from a liquidity point of view. We do have some plans in place.
Just for purposes of the record, I think you use a colloquial term. You called a number and you said bucks. That I'm sure you meant rand.
I meant rand, Chair.
Because it could mean dollars. Yes. Mr. Mapele, I think you were at paragraph 79.
It is public knowledge, 79. I must emphasize that Lavash did not seek the involvement of the PIC in any of its other funding arrangements with Alwani, Rainfin, EOH, it's not listed here, and 4AX, and the other entities referred to by Mr. Holomisa. As is clear, the fact that, you know, we have in excess of that, you know, the debt from the PIC, we have been able to be supported by some of like the big 5 banks in some of like, you know, our growth ambitions of creating a balance sheet on the side of Lavash. Above all, it is important to note that the PIC publicly discloses all its investments. The names of the borrowers and the full nature of each transactions are fully identified and disclosed to the public. In addition, the PIC reports on its activities to Parliament's Standing Committee on Public Accounts and to the Public Finance Committee. All members of Parliament, including Mr. Holomisa, are able to access this information. And we had offered it to all and sundry last year. It is public knowledge that the value of the assets of the PIC is some 2 trillion rands. The PIC, through its unlisted investments portfolio, has approximately 119 private companies which it has backed up to the tune of some 147 billion rands. Of that, Lavash has only been funded to the extent of 1.4 billion rands as opposed to the total 147, which constitutes about 0.95% of that portfolio of 119 companies. This excludes the PIC's investment in listed companies, which accounts for approximately 12% of the listed capital on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. There have never existed any conflicts of interest amongst the various parties I represent as alleged by Mr. Holomisa, or at all. There is no evidence of any sort to support these claims of looting or a cartel of PIC operatives or a fleecing of the PIC. I'm a businessman with interests and networks in both the public and private sectors. I'd like to believe that I'm very deliberate in the positive outcomes which I wish to attain for our investors and stakeholders through the building of innovative and stable platforms which can serve our country and our continent, and also my own interests where possible to the appropriate degree and to the best of my ability. The continued sustainability of my professional commitments in these respects is uppermost and what gets me wake up every morning to go and work. The scurrilous and unfounded allegations by Mr. Holomisa have really done damage to our reputation and my dignity. I want to believe that the correct forum of remedying all that will be in a court. But I would ask the Commission to treat with great caution the alleged conclusions at which Mr. Holomisa claims to have arrived at. The damage done is not confined to me alone. I have a team of 29 people who work with me at Harith. Most of them, especially the professionals, have been with me in excess of 10 years, building and investing in these things. It's important that we maintain and preserve the value of those investments to their fruition and ultimately them doing very well. And as has been noted earlier, they're still looking forward to that carry which must happen one day. To the extent that some of these allegations are made in a manner to cast doubt on some of those investments. Besides the fact that, like I talk about 6,000 jobs which have been created, the amount of people who work in all these companies, in Main One, in Energy, in Lansere, in Kelvin, in Rabai Power Station, in the airports in Tunisia, there are thousands and thousands of people whose investments now become impacted by our equity participation in those, because those then start being questioned as to what is the source of those. Mr. Holomisa's allegations place Harith and its initiatives in the building of this infrastructure at risk and threaten to derail or delay a number of these initiatives which we are engaged in. Harith and Lavash welcome scrutiny in any constructive form. I'm now on 87. And we have offered this since last year. The Harith website includes details of the projects that we have invested in, and we provide our investors with regular reports on the status and performance of each of our assets, much of which is in the public domain in any event. Besides the annual financial statements we prepare, besides the developmental impact report which we prepare each year of all our investments, we also, report quarterly to our investment committee and the board of trustees of the funds. Neither Harith, I go to 89, nor Lavash is a front nor a conduit for the PIC or any other entity. An allegation was made that we are fronting as BEE party on behalf of some white organizations. I take terrible exception to that. Our idea is to build up platforms that we can be very proud of, that we have started building many years of, and have spent lots of time of our own doing that and been very deliberate about the outcomes that we're looking to achieve. As I have shown, Harith, I repeat again, has not funded Lavash and has not received any funds from the PIC on behalf of Lavash, because an allegation was made by Mr. Holomisa that the PIC gave Harith funds to manage on its behalf. That's very far from the actual truth which I've spelled out in this forum. The two entities are distinctly separate, have an entirely different functions and purposes. Mr. Holomisa makes certain allegations as page 19 of his transcript which are also not correct. It is correct that the PIDF and Lanseria that the PIDF 1 owns 50% of Lanseria Airport, and I'm a director of that, and that Mr. Wheatley and I only jointly own a charter and finance company called TWCP, whose funds we are also supported by one of the big five in terms of starting that company, one of the big five banks I'm talking about. And that, for that matter, is also outside of Lavash. Under TWCP, we charter and finance the purchase and leasing of airplanes. We deal with airlines and private individuals, but never with airports. We have no relationship with any airport, nor do we need such a relationship. There are no payments made or services rendered as between Lanseria Airport and TWCP. The only direct and irrelevant connection is that an entity called Lanseria Jet Center leases premises from Lanseria Airport and offers services for some of the charters and financing which we pay it for. These allegations are yet another example of Mr. Holomisa's unfounded conjecture, which is as damaging as it is. Yeah, I won't say that word. As I have said, the allegations have placed all of us in an invidious position where we are now required to explain repeatedly to potential partners the truth about the unfounded allegations by Mr. Holomisa, which have, as he fully intends, regularly been spread in the media. We bear the full brunt of the insults and innuendo in that regard, and yet not one single fact has been proven by him to support his claims and speculations. In each meeting we start with any of our partners or funders, especially even with the banks, we have to start with the explanation of what is happening. We have been blessed and we are fortunate that we have been with some of our partners for many, many years, and some of them have actually been participants even in the funds. The amount of resources, both as concerns legal costs and other expenses and efforts, including the many hours and enormous sums of money, which we have been compelled to spend to try to respond to these allegations, cannot be overstated or gainsaid. It has taken a lot of time and money. In this environment in which the country finds itself in, we would not be able to leave and not attend to some of these allegations. However, those will form part of an action which we are pursuing in the High Court to the extent of the defamation of the entities involved and the individuals concerned. I remain available to this Commission at any time to assist in any further way I can in its aims and purposes, should the Commission need me in that regard.
Yes, thank you. Any further questions, Mr.?
I have no further questions. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Lavash?
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Before I start with my questions, can I just explain to you my position in this commission? I'm not a prosecutor. I'm the chief evidence leader, and my duty to the commission is to ensure that the correct facts are placed before the commission to enable the commission to perform its mandate and report to the President. So when I ask you questions and challenge some of the statements you have made, it is for that purpose to ensure that the correct facts are placed before the Commission. Do you understand that? Thank you. I will start off with asking you some questions in general, but before I do so, can I just ask you about yourself? You stated in your statement that you obtained a B. Proc at Rhodes University in 1998, and shortly thereafter you joined RMB in a management program.
The microphone.
I think Rhodes, it was 1988.
Yes, that's what I said. And you joined shortly thereafter in 1990 RMB in a management program for young graduates.
Yes.
What I want to find out, did you do your articles? Did you write the attorney exam for admission to practice?
No, I didn't. I did my articles for about 9 months, and then I left and then went into corporate. I didn't finish my articles, nor did I practice as an attorney. I went into corporate.
So you have no practical experience as a law practitioner?
No.
Can you just briefly tell me what courses you completed in corporate governance?
In corporate finance or corporate governance?
Corporate finance, sorry, corporate finance.
Okay. I did courses in valuations, and I did courses in private equity.
Is it 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months course?
No, some of these were certificate sort of like stuff or courses that you just attend. Some of them were like 3 or 5 day courses over my experience over time.
And the Harvard Advanced Management Program in 2010, was that a 12-month thing, or what was it?
That is a, I think, 3.5 months program, full-time at Harvard.
The 2014 CEO of the Decade Award, what is that about?
The Associations of Black Securities and Investment Professionals each year recognize an individual within the financial services sector who's had achievement over a period of many years within the sector. And then each year, the Association of Black Securities and Investment Professionals would identify an individual to honor with that award. And I was given that award in 2014.
So that is an award made to professionals belonging to ABSIP?
Yes.
You also mentioned that you served on boards, but what I want to find out, to cut it short, Mr. Moshlele, is when you joined the PIC, was that in 2003?
Yes, it was in 2003.
What practical experience did you have?
I had spent, after my articles, I was a sort of like, I went to Nelspruit, worked in a brewery for a couple of months.
That's great experience, I must say.
Yes. And
I missed that in my career.
it's even better because it was not even like this other beer, it was combo tea, so. And after that, I then went, joined the head office in the legal secretariat of National Sorghum Breweries then. After that, that's when then I went to go work at Rand Merchant Bank. During those years, the Rand Merchant Bank had what they called the class of program. And the class of program identified young graduates to put through the bank in the different units and departments to take them through banking. And they normally took graduates and young individuals who had previously not been been in the financial services sector. And that's where my sort of like, I think, interest within the financial services sector sort of like started and got built up. After Rand Merchant Bank, within Rand Merchant Bank, I was in, within those years that I was there, I think about 2.5 to 3 years, I was exposed to credit, I was exposed to corporate finance, I was exposed to PE funding, actually, that's actually one of those periods in my experience wherein I actually learned about how actually an entity like Rand Merchant Bank and had been built. And when I look at it back now, into like an entity which was started, with about 100,000 rand, started that's Rand Bank, whatever, in the middle of town, ended up today looking like Rand Merchant Investment. So that was one of learning how some of these institutions can be built, and that was what started my interest in all this. After Rand Merchant Bank, in those various departments, corporate finance, and it was actually while I was at Rand Merchant Bank that I did also some of those courses in corporate finance and stuff like that. Some were done internally, and some I think were like run by, one attended, I think, Adverts or something. And after Rand Merchant Bank, I went to go work for the Commonwealth Development Corporation. At the Commonwealth Development Corporation, I got experience in infrastructure funding. That's where I started learning my exposure to, it was actually at that time, I think it was about early 90, about 94, 95, 90, there around, wherein we, even at that time, the projects like the N4 were starting to be considered and being developed, which ran from Witbank to Maputo. It was one of those first cross-border infrastructure projects on the continent, and at CDC, I got, to be involved in that, and that was like my first foray actually into infrastructure finance. And if I may, CDC is the British government's development finance institution. So after 94, when they set up the office here, my boss then, the guy who set up the office, David Morley, I was one of his first hirees in that regard. And after CDC, I thought a very good friend of mine said, perhaps, we can try a very different business. And I can remember my mother was still alive at a stage, and she thought I was crazy because that very different business was to sell furniture. I think I was about 27, 28 at that stage. There was a furniture business which was for sale.
It wasn't Steinoff, was it?
It would still be around if it was Steinoff.
Yes.
At that stage, I think I was about 27, 28, a very good friend of mine said, hey, Tshepo, there's a family who's like moving to Australia. They're selling their furniture business. And the business is for sale. It has like 40 million people, for 40 people. It has like facilities in Randburg. It turns over about 700,000 rands a month. And the building and the business, is for sale for 10 million rands. And I was 27. And I was fortunate enough, I didn't go to the PIC for the money. Citibank and Investec funded that entity. It was around about 1998. I think interest rate, to give you context at the time, 10 million funding, total debt, interest rate about 16-17%. It was a tough slog for about 3 years. Around about 2000 interest rates, if one remembers back then, remember when interest rates shot up to about 18-19%, and then that's when, because our money was debt, we ended up having bearing interest rate of about 25% per month on a furniture business that's 100% funded. There was probably not too many outcomes than the fact that then the debt would start running rings around you. And then that business went bust, even though that is a very tough time. I went back into the formal employment, dusted myself, got up and started looking for work again and putting my CV out. And then I got employed at the Development Bank of Southern Africa in the private sector investments unit as the head thereof, and looking at infrastructure investments in South Africa and in the SADC region. Then in 2003, when I was then approached by then Mr. Molefe to go join the PIC. That's how I get there to 2003 and 2006.
Thank you. That was what I was looking for. So you had a good dose of practical experience and training in the private sector before you joined the PIC. Would that be correct?
That would be correct.
And you also had the experience as a young entrepreneur of starting a business and seeing the ups and downs of business in life.
Proper ups and downs.
Right. If we can move now to your position at PIC and the later move to Harith. As I look at the PIC, Harith Fund and Harith Partners and Lavash, there are two main role players that feature everywhere. That is you and Mr. Moleketi. Is that correct?
That's correct.
The idea to approach the GEPF in 2007, was that the idea of Mr. Molefe, Mr. Brian Molefe?
I think the initial approach was in 2006, not 2007.
Sorry, the memo was in 2007. Yeah. You're quite right, it's 2006.
Yes. I think it was, you can say as the CEO then, he did that, I did the work, but then it was something driven by the PIC under the leadership of Mr. Molefe.
Why I'm asking this question is, my understanding is at the time, the PIC was dealing with more than 80+% of the investments by GEPF. Is that correct?
I don't know the exact percentage, but I think that would be the issue, yes.
But at the time, the PIC had no mandate to invest outside the Republic in Africa and other countries.
I don't know whether about other countries, but the PIC didn't have a mandate for Africa. Yes.
So to move into Africa and to take part in the dream of former President Mbeki, another vehicle had to be sought. Is that correct?
To pursue the ideals of a Pan-African Infrastructure Development Fund,
Yes.
out of that challenge which was put to the PIC at the time, and to attract other private sector investors, other capital, and other Africans, it was agreed that a separate entity would need, a vehicle would need to be formed to do that outside of like the core capacity of the PIC, yes.
Yes.
And also to seek other partners.
Yes, and was stated in your statement in paragraph 12, the fund was never intended to be a public sector-led initiative. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
And it is also stated in the memorandum to the GEPF, and if I recall correctly, also in the annual report of the PIC in 2007. Be that as it may, in your statement you make it clear that there was no intention that this be a public sector initiative. Yep.
As I said also in one of my exhibits, under page 14, it says that under discussion, paragraph 26, it is envisaged that investors in the fund will consist of public pension funds from the African continent as well as investors from the private sector.
Yes.
Yes.
So, as I understand your statement, it was decided you are the jockey for this new venture, and you will establish this new entity, and money will be obtained from the GEPF. Is that correct?
Yes, from the GEPF and other investors across the
Yes,
continent.
Yes. Can you recall who drafted the facilitation trust and the trust and the legal documents for this new venture?
Actually, in one of
if I can help you, is it perhaps TWB, Tugendorf, Wopnik and Panchetti and Partners? Or is it a different firm?
I think at the stage there was TWB, but also I think there was some of the work which was done by, I think it was Hofmeyer. Yes, Hofmeyer, Hofstein and Dinwala at the time. I think which assisted maybe some of like the trust and stuff like that, if I'm not wrong, yes.
Right. Now, you have testified, you have established this entity, HFM. First of all, there was this facilitation trust, and then HFM. Originally 100% owned by you, and then the shares transferred to PIC. Who was, except for yourself, who was the team in HFM in 2007, 2008?
Up to the stage, you know, we started fundraising in 2006 when we went outside of like the PIC and operating through the facilitation trust at the time, and we actually like found premises in Ferry Glen for the facilitation. I think it was about April, May 2006, and I had a secretary then, which I started off with, Ms. Fozia Sidwell. She's still with me today. Because she had at the time been temping at the PIC, and I said, okay, you just temping there. There's this thing, you can still temp, let's see what happens. Maybe just like to give it, so I took her. There was Tenjiwe Vanda, who was like, you know, who used to work in my team at Isibaya, who was one of the on the research side and everything, and worked with me. And also there was at the time Stuart Bradley, and Stuart Bradley was a gentleman which I knew and I had met through my, I think perhaps some of my interactions at, I can't remember, it was maybe like Commonwealth Development Corporation or something. But Stuart was like a British citizen who had been working on trying to raise his fund and everything. And then I said, Stuart, can you come and consult with us whilst we do this? So those were like, within the first, I think, 3 or 4 months, people that we got to do that. There was a point at which, you know, when we tried to work together with the Nigerians, they actually sent some gentleman called Reginald Ehebu, who was going to come and maybe also bring some of like the Nigerian government money into the fund, which just never worked on, and then like the thing went on. And then later on, up to then raising this fund and getting on first close, when in October 2007, by then I had already hired 2 other individuals to join the team, because by then we were seeing that we're getting close to, there might be a business that might be possible and which might be, the fund is, might exist. And so at that stage, by the time we reached final first close of the fund, I had Sipoma Kubela hired and Lisiba Moralane by then on the team. Because also with most of these funds, once you start doing them and putting them together, the investors want to know that once there's a fund, there are people who are going to be able to work on it.
That's what I want to find out from you. Was there anybody in your team with experience
Yes.
to deal with complicated and complex investments in Africa?
Yes.
Who are they?
Myself, I had worked at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We had invested in infrastructure across the continent. We had done the N4. We had done some of those things. Sipoma Kubela, when I got him, he had been working on infrastructure on some projects in Nigeria. and he is a CA and an MBA graduate. He's got that. Lisiwa Mralane, he's an MBA graduate. He had been working for Vodacom in Tanzania or something like that. So therefore, those were some of the experiences which were there to do that.
The reason why I'm asking you this is that in paragraph 32 of your statement, you state the following. By September 27, HFM had secured 65 million US for the PIDF, thus becoming the first 15-year infrastructure fund of its size and scope ever to be established in Africa. Fundraising, especially for a new fund in Africa, pursued by a small team lacking any real funding track record, proved to be a complex and lonely task, etc. To cut it short, what I find astonishing is that the GEPF and other investors just decided to put 630 million into a start-up fund in South Africa.
I don't think, on my part, I find it that odd. I had spoken about the experience which I've had up to then. I've spoken about my experience at the PIC, at the Commonwealth Development Corporation, at the Development Bank of Southern Africa. I told you about Mr. Sipho Makhubela and do that. And also, immediately after that, on closure, I hired, our chief investment officer, because that was like going to be the thing. Mr. Alvin Vessels, who had been working at ABSA, who had worked on projects like, the, Gautrain, and some other infrastructure projects while at ABSA. So therefore, a team was built in that process. And when you look at, perhaps that's why also you had the construct of the fund manager in the manner that it was put together, that you had the likes of Old Mutual sitting on the board, giving some of that advice and some of that oversight in terms of what they had been able to do. You had ABSA Bank sitting on the board, giving some of that oversight and helping and assessing in some of that, into like the way it is done. And if you also look at the vigorous, approval processes you had of the fund, for that manager, that's why they were even much more, the investors were able to take a bet on that, because even like the investment process and the investment decision approvers relied on an investment committee set up, overseen, and independently chaired by the investors and the board of trustees.
The point I'm trying to make, there's a huge difference between building the Gautrain or the N4 in South Africa and building a power station or a wind farm in Kenya or Sudan. Any team member that had exposure to that type of investment in Africa
if you look at, as I sort of like said, we, in the DBSA, we worked on SADC. DBSA invested not just in South Africa, in SADC. And in these programs, Advocate Luba, when you look at it, through you, Chair, you find that, a fund of our nature invests alongside other equity providers who you do that with. That's why, and also like in the management of risk and the sharing of that and the development of those projects, you find the type of, structures which, you find like 3 or 4 equity partners who do that. There's normally a developer of a project who does that. And as a fund, we normally don't sort of like, whilst we will fund and like, sit on the boards of those things, you'd find that the development and operation of that is by an entirely different company or team, which we then come in and back up as a financial partner, as an equity participant. So therefore, those projects we have participated in, we have done, those are project finance type structures, and we have been exposed to them.
Mr. Moleketi, did he join in 2008, Harith?
Mr. Moleketi became a director of Harith Fund Managers in 2007, whilst he was still also the chairman of the PIC, because at that time the PIC was very much like holding the share. And also because of the nature of what partnerships we tried to create with this thing, the PIC selected him as the chairman of Harith Fund Managers in 2007.
I'll come to that. Had he any experience in this type of fund management, Mr. Moleketi?
Mr. Moleketi was a director, he was not an executive, and he had the experience of being a chairman of the PIC.
Now, can we deal now with this issue, which I find interesting, that it seems to me, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that the PIC had an about turn about the independence of this fund management, of the money that the GEPF put into this fund. They were very reluctant to give the shares to what was originally agreed with investors into the fund.
That is very clear in the correspondence which I have shared with you, that having promised and having raised these funds and having gotten the investors to commit to the PIDF in the manner that they did, and in a manner that they believed that the Harith Fund Managers would be structured, that there were many, if I were to be totally honest, battles about that. If I would even be able to share with you some of the letters I wrote personally, because I couldn't cloud this commission, whereby we intimated that the management team and some of the people which had now been hired, because by then now you had like a fuller team, had not signed up to this type of formation of a manager and were prepared to leave. And if I were to be even much more clear, this caused a big rift between the management team of Harith and PIC, because the investors, demanded and insisted on these arrangements. When we were raising the fund and going all over the place, that was an undertaking which was given to the investors that this would be a private sector-led and managed entity, and that's why some of them insisted on having shares in the company. So there was, I'll leave it at that. There was a major, in a sense, for a couple of years, some form of a fallout between the two for that exact thing.
Who was the difficult person at the PIC taking the stance? You can open your heart. You're in front of a commission of inquiry.
And the whole country. I don't know what to say, Advocate Leber. It was a very, very tough time in our lives at that time as Harith, interacting with the PIC management at that time. There was a total fallout, and I think that's why you actually found that for many, many years, there was not even much of any form of collaboration, even in a sense of like investing in other infrastructure projects or tackling them together. And that's why you even found perhaps like PIC also starting like to make its own direct investments outside of South Africa, when we thought that like, no, we'd be, you know, the entity to partner them with some of our experiences and shares we had lost in one or two of those investments across the continent, which you rightly say, you know, it's not like an easy environment in which to do some of the things that we have done up to thus far. But I'm loath to say it was this individual or that individual. I'm very loath to say that.
I can see that you're uncomfortable to do that, but would it then be correct to say that it's not in dispute, there's evidence before this commission that since 2009, the PIC had a mandate to invest in Africa. They in fact invested in EcoBank in Nigeria, etc. And is it correct then to say that because of the bad blood between Harith and the PIC, when you started the second fund in 2012, you went back to the GEPF for funding and didn't go to the PIC as a partner? Would that be correct?
No, the reason why we went to the GEPF and not the PIC was that in going forward, and when we were having discussions with the GEPF, because they are also an investor in PIDF, one and did sit on the board, and we talked to them and we approached them. They decided that like they would again look at that investment on their own. It's true to say that there wasn't perhaps much engagement with the PIC in terms of that regard. I would, you know, allude to the fact that we did try to have that partnership being strengthened, and so that we could do things together. We thought that we had built up some expertise, you know, like in making money and losing money, you build up, you know, you learn some lessons sometimes, and we had learned some of those in terms of what we do. And we felt that perhaps we could partner with them more when the other's not happening. But I guess perhaps at that time the ground was not that fertile enough yet for that to be resurrected. And as a management team at Harith, there was a need for survival and continuity, and to continue using some of those skills learned, yes.
Are you aware that the GEPF is still not satisfied with the situation with PIC, and that the shares that the PIC hold should actually be the shares of the GEPF? You're aware that they're still unhappy about that situation?
Advocate Lubert, that has not been shared with me, that the GEPF would like those shares to be theirs. To the extent that they felt that way, I'm not sure, perhaps that could have been raised when we were doing Harith General Partners, and I'm sure it would have found fertile ground.
I'm not going to waste your time and the time of the Commission, but I just want to put on record that you can comment thereon. I have received a legal opinion by Tugendhaft, Wapnick and Banchetti, the firm who originally drafted the documentation for Harith. It is dated today, 16 April 2019, and I'll make a copy available of this legal opinion to your legal team and to the Commission, where the GEPF is advised by this law firm that they should take legal action against the PIC because the shares belong to them, and payments made to the PIC in dividends and management fees belong to the GEPF. It seems to me you agree with that.
No, Advocate Lubu, I didn't say I agree with that. I haven't seen that opinion. I am loath to get involved in that one. I have unfortunately not been told as yet by the GEPF of that action or of what they intend to do. But I'm sure the GEPF is free to invest and manage according to the way they would like to do that. At the time, if I may sort of like say, how the PIC, as I alluded earlier on, got to sit with the 46% was that they funded the seed capital to get the initiative going out of their operations budget and not out of the money which they manage on behalf of the GEPF.
Chair, I wanted to let Mr. Mohlwele give his answer first, but in the scheme of things, that question about whether Mr. Mohlwele agrees with the legal opinion is an unfair question. We haven't seen it. He hasn't seen it. We have no idea what the basis for that opinion is. I'm not sure that Mr. Mohlwele's response in this regard can take the matter anywhere.
I'm quite prepared to withdraw the question, Mr. Commissioner, but
we'd like to see the opinion.
I will hand over the opinion, but the opinion is directly in line with the evidence of this witness about the rift between Harith and PIC, but I agree with my learned friend. It's not necessary for this witness to elaborate on that.
Yes, that's fine. Can I just ask, the 46% shareholding that's held by the PIC, is that from the time that they advanced the 17 million, or is it in respect of the 250 million that came directly from the GEPF?
Chair, the 46% that they hold today stems from the initial time when we started in 2006-07, when the PIC made the loan of 17 million rands to the Facilitation Trust to get HFM and PIDF going. So the 46% they enjoy to this date stems from that time. And yes, it's not from that, as I said earlier on, the PIC has not made an investment in PIDF 1 or 2.
Am I correct? Did I understand you correctly that the GEPF made available the commitment of the 250 million US in December 26?
Yes, it was a commitment in principle. If you, I can actually read the letter. What happened then is that, first of all, we know that motivation was done to the GEPF, and what they gave was it was almost like an approval in principle, subject to negotiation and agreement on the final details of the trust and what it would look like and every other thing, and the involvement of all other investors in the fund.
Can you refer me to that letter, please?
It's on page 70 of my
70.
yes, 70 of my index, the annexures. It is directed to Mr. T. Mohlwele, CEO Pan-African Infrastructure Development Fund, 11 December 2006. Dear Tsepo, headline, Pan-African Infrastructure Development Fund. I refer to your proposal dated 11 November 2005. The Board of Trustees of the GEPF, at its meeting of 6 December 2006, granted approval to invest $250 million into the Pan-African Infrastructure Development Fund. Approval is granted subject to negotiation of acceptable terms and conditions in the detailed agreement and based on the materialization of the governance structure and procedures confirmed by your office.
No, we've read that. When was this agreement concluded that the author of this letter, Mr. Couscous, referred to? Can you remember? The date of the agreement. It says it is the approval is granted subject to negotiation of acceptable terms and conditions in the detailed agreement and based on the materialization of the governance structure and procedures confirmed by your office. When was that agreement concluded with the GEPF?
There wasn't an agreement concluded with the GPF up to that stage. What the GPF had been provided with that stage was that motivation for them to commit $250 million to the fund and how that would operate. So that's how that was done. So this letter is based on that initial motivation to them.
When was the agreement concluded between the GEPF and Harith to manage the fund?
The agreement it was not between GPF and Harith to manage the fund. The agreement is between Harith, which was Harith Fund Managers then, and PIDF. What GEPF does is sign a commitment letter to the PIDF to be an investor. And then all the investors commit to the PIDF fund, and then the fund transacts with the fund manager. PIDF fund then contracts with Harith Fund Managers to manage PIDF on the back of those commitments from all the 8 or 9 so investors.
Were you able, or was it legal, in 2006 and the beginning of 2007 to raise funds without a license being approved by the authority? I think it's FAICS.
Yeah, we were, until you've raised a fund, you don't have the fund, and until you've registered the fund manager, you don't have the fund manager. So that fund manager was registered, and then the fund was done. So, and I want to believe that we had all those approvals and things required as Harith Fund Managers to be a manager, and we can supply whatever approvals we required. I think that in 2006 or 7 to register as a fund manager. I'm sure we would not have been able to do that.
I think
with all the approvals that we've got.
I think Mr. Berger indicated that your colleague has all the information about the approvals. We'll deal with that when he testifies.
Yes, I said that we would get back, we would lead Mr. Wheatley on that.
Okay.
Oh yes, and my learner friend, Mr. Slon, has just reminded me that Mr. Matlwele had said that he would also be getting input from his compliance officer.
Yes, that's correct.
As to what licenses were in place, and in relation to Commissioner Marcus's question, the relevant dates of all of the licenses, both for HFM and for HGP.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner. Is it correct that you were appointed and employed as the CEO of HFM with effect from 1 September 2007?
Yes, Council.
The position was not advertised. You were selected the previous year as the man to do the job. Is that correct?
No, I was not selected the previous year as the man to do the job. The previous year, from April 2006, what I was selected to do was to run with the Secretariat of the Pan-African Infrastructure Facilitation Trust to work on the initiative of establishing this thing and getting it going. And once we had been successful in securing the commitments we had been able to do, and the fund manager was, we got a shelf company which was going to be the fund manager, and with the PIC owning that entity at that time, and with the investors, it was clear that I was going to be the CEO, since I had spent most of the time and everything in doing everything up to that stage.
That is the point I've made, that I tried to make, is that there was no need to look for anybody else. You were, from the start, busy with this new venture. You did all the work, and you were the person to take over as CEO.
I can say I actually put in a bit of my own to try and ensure that at least ensure that I get the job.
The point made by General Holomisa in his evidence was that, and I'd like your comment on that, was there any direct or indirect benefit for you and to Mr. Moleketi moving from the PIC to Harith? Was there any impropriety that is covered by the terms of reference of this commission? Can you comment on that?
Advocate Lebe, I do not think that there was any conflict of interest. Everything from the beginning of resigning from the PIC, having a facilitation trust, going all around the world with all the other partners that we tried to get on board to build this fund and have it come to fruition, all the approvals which were even sought and received, even for establishing the facilitation trust, not only by the board of the PIC, but also by National Treasury and the relevant minister at the time, and all the approvals and checks which were done. The investors, when we think about this, it was not only GEPF. You also had the likes of ABSA with a huge commitment, $125 million. They would make sure that everything is proper and above board. Old Mutual, we drew on all these partners to do that. And I would, venture to even say that Harith is structured the way it is. And actually, very well so, in a sense that it actually protects it from, without sounding in any other way, political interference in the investments that it makes on behalf of its investors. Those investors are at the table, they make the decisions, and they are very much involved across the table, private sector and public sector. And so, therefore, the issue of conflict does not arise at all in my case with regards to that. There is very little involvement on a day-to-day basis in the operations and management of HFM or HGP by the PIC. There is no involvement or whatever in the investments made or done by the PIDF or recommended to the PIDF by the PIC. There is none at all. And I think the investors have in this case created a platform which protects their investment from that type of thing and makes it very clear to them. So there was a time you asked about, I can't remember whether it was Commissioner Lidija or Commissioner Marcus, who asked about the whole issue of that the investment was made, the decision to invest directly was made by the GEPF and not the PIC, and what I felt about that. And perhaps I can say that today here, that at the time, as I said, I had my concerns saying, the GEPF, the issue of like interacting with it, with drawdowns, with fund management things, is not something that they had done, that this would be problematic. And then that actually the PIC had done this before, perhaps it would be easier for them if they're managing it. And it actually, when one sees then the issues which happened, as you say, then what happened then from 2008 to very late into like that whole draft which happened, I think it actually worked out very well, that you actually had the actual investors and owners of the capital close to the management with the other private sector investors, and they had made sure that we are able out of this vehicle to attract other private sector investments and make the type of investments that we have done free of those other type of issues which would not be commercial or in the best interest of the investors. So that's the way I would see it, sir.
I don't want to dwell too long on it, but the information given to me by my investigating team is that the investments made with PIDF 1, the returns are poor. Is that correct or incorrect?
We talked about the returns in terms of like, the gross returns, like in dollar terms of PIDF 1, which are like in the region of about 6%. And like, net, as I said, like, maybe around 4 or so, I'm not on the exact number. I would venture to say that if you look at PIDF 1 and the period in which it invested after the financial crisis, that affects the whole issue of the investments that you get, which were made in all these countries in local currency and against the dollar. And if you look at like what has happened to all the local currencies across the continent, that has been a factor. And if you also look at the fact that, I'll admit to the fact that there was one investment which like didn't go well, which was like in Kenya, which was called it happens, I think, in a portfolio of about 10 investments that you'd get 1 or 2 entities which would do that in any private equity portfolio. But as we sit here and we look at, let's say, like some of the investments that we have under PIDF 1 and what we are projecting that they will do, as I alluded earlier on, as to like some of what, and I did mention them, the likes of the fiber optic company, the likes of like the power company, right? And also the fact that, Mr. Luba, in all these years, we also haven't had an exit yet in terms of like any of these investments. We are very comfortable that we will be able to meet that. And if you look at also, like, we have had a lot of volatility of African currency in the past sort of couple of years. That's why the Fund 1 had that type of thing. And I think that would have subjected to that. But to the extent that to say that they have lost money, no, we deny that. And to the extent that to say that that this will turn out, good, that we thoroughly believe it. And if you look at the performance of our current assets that we have in a form of, the fiber optic company, the subsea cable, the, 2.2 gigawatts of power that we have across the continent in various projects, and inherent value in all that. Some of the infrastructure assets, the airport assets that we have. We believe that and as you can see, I think it's also even clear from some of the investment of even the advert that you've shown from GEPF itself, into how some of those underlying entities are performing. We are very optimistic that by the life of the fund, we will reach that. Sometimes, if I just make an example, if you would look at then, what the currency would have done between a valuation in 2013 and 2011, moving from about perhaps in a region of about 10 to about 13, just in a rand, I'm not even talking about Nigeria or other countries, that would impact on the dollar return of your investment. But in that regard, I would still argue that getting a return which perhaps would beat US treasuries in that for infrastructure for across the continent. I think we're still on target to do that. But besides that, we also look at that from a developmental impact point of view. We believe that we're on the right track, and we have generated other benefits for our investors and for the continent and for South Africa, than that. But the return must still be met, and I believe that now we will be able to satisfy it.
Okay. Can I ask you on PIDF 1, there was a huge effort put into getting funding from other African countries and pension funds. I believe there was even a workshop in South Africa where African countries were invited to. It seems to me that the appetite by other African countries to invest in this fund was nowhere. Only 2 of our neighbors in Ghana showed any interest.
As I alluded earlier on, Advocate Lebe, in PIDF 1, in 2006, 2007, you'd go to I think 80% of these countries, you'd find that they had not even invested in any private equity fund. So investing in that type of structure for them was foreign. For some of them, even today, it's still a foreign concept.
So you agree that the appetite wasn't there?
No, I wouldn't say that the appetite wasn't there. What we then do in some of the instances, take for instance, the ARMA fund we have with the partnership in Nigeria. That fund invests only in Nigeria, and it's the Nigerian pension funds. So therefore, we'd invest alongside it there. But it's unable to invest in PIDF because it would only invest in Nigerian pension funds.
All right, let me ask you this then. When you launched PIDF 2, the South African investors also walked away. ABSA, Old Mutual, not interested.
I think Advocate Lube, ABSA walked away because, from the bank's point of view, having that type of equity on their balance sheet affected that, they are, in terms of Basel 2 and 3, affected them adversely. And if you look at that period, ABSA had pulled out actually out of most, if not all, some of their private equity funds and commitments to those and sold out. And we were fortunate enough that they decided to stick with us throughout that. With regards to Old Mutual, the big issue with Old Mutual, we actually said it to them then, that Old Mutual, you have an exposure and a partnership with Macquarie, and you have an exposure and a partnership with us. What then would be then, would you choose then between the two? And at the time then, Macquarie then chose to do that. And also, Advocate Lube, if you look at other infrastructure fund, which tried to raise funds, I don't know perhaps which one we can list, which perhaps managed to get in excess of $400 million. It is a tough challenge in this environment. Investors are looking more for liquid platforms. To invest in infrastructure is a tough sell. But besides that, with the bid that we are doing, we still managed to get some of the AFDB to come in. Botswana Pension Officers Fund. It's not a huge fund. So, but then what they could do that. Namibia, as opposed to coming into that fund, we're managing a fund for them in Namibia. The Nigerians managing their funds for them, they are not in that fund. So therefore, that's a structure we see going forward. And also, we also currently working on, in this environment wherein commitment to 15-year, infrastructure fund which are illiquid is proving very difficult for all and sundry. Even pure general private equity funds are having a struggle at doing that. So therefore, with what we've been able to do, I'm fairly confident that we've done that. And also, you do need that belief by African capital to start doing that. And the extent to which what we have done now, we still see positive results.
Mr. Mashwele, just to remind you, as I did Mr. Olumisa yesterday, when you are asked a question, it now sounds as if the two of you are having a dialogue because you are addressing yourself to Advocate Lebe. Address yourself to us.
Can you just explain to the Commission, Mr. Mashwele, against this background of the rift between GEPF and PIC with the first fund, Now you launch HGP as the second fund. Why did you sell 30% of the shares in that company to the PIC? For what reason?
As a management team, we felt that PIC had been there in the initial fund. Like we went to all the other investors and like, they had their reasons for not continuing into like ABSA, getting out of fund management, Old Mutual, moving with their other, own fund, which is like AIM. We felt that like, we can't just go and start on our own. We said, no, let's go and discuss with PIC. Do you still want to be in this partnership? We went to them. There were many discussions. There were many negotiations. And we said, maybe we can still work together with regards to infrastructure on the continent. But even besides that, I think my personal feeling was that to the extent that like, they had been there with the initial seed funding. You can't just say, I'm going ahead, then without you, then I'm dealing that. It was a thing of saying like, we started, can we still work together? Nothing, I think, much more than that.
Thank you. And can you just explain to the Commission, and it's something I don't understand, and I must readily confess I'm not a financier or a banker, and I have little knowledge. I immediately concede that. Why would you consider raising funds, investing in infrastructure in Africa, while there is a massive need in South Africa for investment in infrastructure, basic services like water and electricity? Why not invest in South Africa?
I think all funds get their different mandates. They look at different things, what they would like to do. But I also believe that there's a huge opportunity for South African investors to also invest on the continent. If you look at some of the ability to be able to contract with a power company in Kenya and get a offtake agreement in euros, or in Nigeria to get an offtake agreement in dollars. And, but also in addition to that, we are still very much invested in South Africa. If you look at like, some of the assets that we have right now and that we are developing in the form of Novo, in the form of our ambition, to develop and perhaps hopefully around Calvin one day you can develop this gas-powered power station to the extent of about 600 megawatts. And that's actually one of the reasons why we thought that we think that there's a huge opportunity there to look at something like that when it happens. The fiber optic company that we have an investment in, the airport operation that we have invested in. So therefore there's that. But in addition to that, I think South Africa has a huge opportunity in terms of its programs, in terms of its depth of its capital markets, to be that platform and that vehicle which can contribute to the development of Africa and in that sense to its own development. Because through that, it can be able to create some of like the backflow which will then like end up like, benefiting South Africa in terms to the extent that it is part of that. And I think there are good returns to be made out of that. But besides that too, I think South Africa has an opportunity to be that capital markets, capital for the continent by the depth of its industry.
Mr. Commissioner, it's 10 to 4. I may have further questions, but there is some documentation that I still need to have a look at. And I don't want to waste the time of the Commission. If there are perhaps questions by the Commission to complete the time till 4 o'clock.
So all in all, you have not finished your questioning,
No.
your cross-examination. Okay. Is there any arrangement that has been made?
Mr. Commissioner, we have agreed, if it is sanctioned by you, that I'll make other arrangements for Tuesday, and that we will adjourn till Tuesday to complete this part of the work. I don't know if it would be possible to start a bit earlier, but we're in agreement that if we have Tuesday, we'll finish in the day.
Chair, can I just make a suggestion? We thought that we would be finished with Mr. Mahlwele today. If there's still questions from our learned friend for Mr. Mahlwele, and we still have to have Mr. Moleketi and then Mr. Wheatley on Tuesday the 23rd, can I ask that perhaps we start at 9:30, if that's possible, on Tuesday the 23rd, just so that by 10 o'clock, hopefully, we can start with Mr. Moleketi.
Will that be okay with you?
I'm fine with that, Mr. Commissioner. I don't know how much time the Commission will need, and I'm sure my learned friend will spend some time on re-examination.
No.
That's good to hear. So yes, then we can finish again without limiting the Commission to time. We should be finished by 10.
And will we be able to sit until 4 o'clock on the 23rd? Then I think we should finish.
Right, on Tuesday then, we'll adjourn now with Mr. Mahlwele, and then on Tuesday we will resume at 9:30. Right, by agreement. But tomorrow we continue with the program. Yes,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
that's correct. We shall then adjourn until tomorrow at 10.